Hello and a warm welcome to this extra edition of Money Majlis, where we explore the intersection of technology, consumer behavior, and the future of global finance. I'm your host, Suvo Sarkar. In today's episode of Money Majlis Extra, we have a truly fascinating guest, Dr. Parag Khanna, one of the world's leading strategic geographers and futurists. He is the best-selling author of 7 books, including The Future is Asian and Connectography, and has traveled to over 150 countries, yes, that is 150 countries, to understand the pulse of our interconnected planet. But before we dive into our discussion, here is a quick commercial break to acknowledge the sponsors of this podcast.
Money Majlis is proudly supported by Aqua Now, the premier crypto-as-a-service provider, now building in partnership with the top financial institutions in the Middle East. Discover more at aquanow.com.
Money Majlis is brought to you by E&, a global technology group.
Money Majlis is brought to you by Intellect Design Arena, driving digital adoption in banking and insurance.
Money Majlis is brought to you by Live Digital Bank, powered by Emirates NBD. Trust and innovation combined.
Money Majlis is brought to you by Network International, the leading digital payments technology company in the Middle East and Africa.
My guest today on Money Majlis Extra is Dr. Parag Khanna, a globally renowned strategy advisor, best-selling author, and one of the most dynamic thinkers of our age. He is the founder and CEO of AlphaGeo, an AI-powered geospatial analytics platform dedicated to enhancing resilience and informing global investment in an era of rising volatility. He is also the founder and managing partner of FutureMap, an advisory firm that leverages data and scenario planning to provide foresight on rapidly evolving geopolitical and economic landscapes. Dr. Khanna's distinguished career is truly international. He has served as Senior Research Fellow at several leading institutions, including the New America Foundation and the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. His expertise has been sought by governments across North America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. In 2007, he was Senior Geopolitical Advisor to U.S. Special Operations Forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has played an advisory role for the U.S. National Intelligence Council, the World Economic Forum, and Singapore's Committee on the Future Economy. His books, including Move, Where People Are Going for a Better Future, The Future is Asian, Connectography, and Technocracy in America, span the topics of migration, global order, and technology. His works have been translated into over 20 languages, inspiring global infrastructure and connectivity initiatives. Dr. Khanna sits on several prominent advisory boards and committees. Notably, he serves on the Board of Advisors for Henley and Partners and the UAE Ministry of Economy's International Advisory Council. Parag's personal journey is equally fascinating. Born in Kanpur, India, he grew up between India, UAE, Germany, and the US, earning degrees from Georgetown University and a PhD from the London School of Economics. His partner in life, and often in thought, is Dr. Ayesha Khanna, co-founder and CEO of Addo AI. Together with their 2 children, Zara and Zubin, they are famed for their love of travel, cultural immersion, and what they call mini bacticals, extended explorations where they dive into new cultures as a family. Now Singaporean citizens, the Khannas continue to influence global conversations on technology, innovation, and the future of society. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Parag Khanna, who is joining me on Money Majlis from Singapore. Parag, let me start with a very important question. Given that you travel across 150 countries, what is your secret in beating jet lag?
Go with the flow. is probably the answer that would most resonate with people, because of course when you have jet lag, you lose the will to fight back against it. But first of all, Sumo, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I love the title itself, Money Majlis, and your philosophy and vision. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Well, there is a saying, an object in motion remains in motion. So in some senses, I'm perpetually jet lagged because I'm sort of always on the move. I think it was after the tail end, would have been 2006, 2007, after completing the research for my first book. I had traveled nonstop for 3 years around the world to profile, emerging markets and swing states in the geopolitical balance of power. And I thought to myself, I had reached escape velocity. I didn't really need to ever go home. Wasn't even quite sure where that was anymore. So escape velocity is the best aeronautical metaphor for combating jet lag.
Well said. Well said, Parag. Coming back to your favorite continent, Asia, you describe Asia as, quote, the world's dominant economic, political, and cultural force, unquote, with 40% of global GDP, nearly 5 billion people, and 48 countries. At this scale, what common drivers truly unite Asia, and what you think divides us the most?
Well, history might be the greatest divisive force in Asia, yet it's also been, of course, a domain in which there's been great commonality and convergence. But let's start with the 500 years of colonialism and the Cold War that, of course, were a very strong divisive force in Asian history. By the end of this period of colonialism and Cold War, neighboring countries had less business and cultural and other ties with each other than they had with their erstwhile colonial masters. But if you fast forward to today, less than 3 decades later, or about 3 decades later, you do have this situation that we've arrived at where Asian countries have more trade, investment, migration, and other kinds of flows and ties with each other than with the rest of the world. So the most profound fact for people to take away is that 500 years of colonial and Cold War division have been superseded, surmounted in just 30 years' time. And that is despite the fact that Asia is the most dizzyingly diverse and heterogeneous region of the world, ethnically, culturally, linguistically, and so on. So it's a monumental achievement. And I don't think it would have been possible if Asians did not have that inherited intuition for the Silk Roads that propelled the previous waves of integration and interdependence among Asian societies that predate by many centuries, of course, colonialism and the Cold War. So the recovery of the Silk Road instinct and intuition to reconstruct this Asia for Asians system is what Asia has achieved today. Now, you asked a very important question, which is what do they have in common despite this diversity? You do, of course, have a wide range of political regimes and other kinds of societal characteristics, socioeconomic degrees of development, and so on and so on. Nonetheless, in my Asia book in 2019, I argued that there are three particular new Asian values. And of course, I emphasize new Asian values because, as you well know, in the 1990s, the term Asian values was used in a different context, and that sort of faded from the spotlight with the Asian financial crisis. And that term fell out of favor from the late 90s all the way until the present. So for a 20-year period, people stopped talking about Asian values. But it's precisely in this time that Asia converged so substantially. So it was worth revisiting what might be the new Asian values. And I came up with precisely three. And these three, again, transcend the diversity of the Asian landscape. The first was technocratic governance. which is to say a bias or a deference towards a strong executive branch and head of state with a long-term vision and mandate for national modernization. So technocratic governance, whether that's of the Chinese or Indian or Singaporean variety. The second is mixed capitalism. In Asia, we don't dispute that the state can and should perhaps even have a strong role in the economy, that there should be industrial policy, national champion subsidies where needed, high commitment to R&D, and so on and so on. So mixed capitalism, state capitalism, again, there are varieties across Asia. And the third is a social conservatism. Because in fact, even the most liberal society in Asia, to the extent that one can finger any one in particular, we do take a very incremental and experimental approach to liberalization, social liberalization. And the reason is because, of course, we have such strong or high degree of internal diversity that one has to be very careful about shouting fire in a crowded theater, or the digital equivalent of that, meaning internet speech, and so on and so on. So social conservatism, mixed capitalism, and technocratic governance are the three pillars or the three new Asian values that I do believe apply broadly to a greater degree or to a strong degree as far as Russia, to Australia, to India, to Japan, and everywhere in between.
No, well said, Parag. You also said the future is Asian, not just because of China's rise, but also due to the collective dynamism of the continent. Now, in your analysis, Parag, what facts and figures and data points best illustrate Asia's growing self-sufficiency, let's say in trade and investment and innovation?
It's a great question. Well, first of all, if you do take this geographical totality of Asia, which is again from the Mediterranean Sea to the Arctic, because you should be including Russia, right? Russia is known to geographers as North Asia, not as Eastern Europe. Politically, it has been classified as Eastern Europe, but obviously doesn't even belong there anymore from a diplomatic standpoint. Meanwhile, Russia has been embraced by Asia. So Russia is North Asia. Australia is not tectonically part of Asia, but is economically part of Asia. So again, from the Mediterranean to Japan, from Russia to Australia. So what are some of the data points? Well, again, when you look at trade, I have this map that shows the dyads of bilateral trade volumes between pairs of Asian states or subregions. And by subregions, one can mean ASEAN or the GCC countries. And I took 5-year increments from 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020. And every single pair of Asian states has more or less increased its trade with the others, such that, again, you asked the question about self-sufficiency, the majority, a substantial majority of Asian trade is with other Asian powers. Even more fundamentally than a particular metric, just conceptually, if you're thinking about the optimization of land, labor, and capital, right? Think about Asian states and Asian neighbors as a system, again, a geographical system in which you have all the labor. Obviously, you have most of the world's population. You have all the land. You have the greatest land area of any continent. You have the financial capital. You have the industrial capacity. You have the natural resources and raw materials, right? Food, fuel, and other commodities. So does Asia have all of the land, labor, and capital to continue to optimize its internal relationships and dynamics to be even more self-sufficient than it has become? The answer is yes. So within that, you can fill in specific metrics like trade volumes and FDI flows and other sorts of things. But all of them effectively do contribute to this almost teleological, progression towards greater Asian capacity for self-sufficiency.
Parag, you stated, and I quote, that billions of Asians growing up in the past 2 decades have experienced geopolitical stability, rapidly expanding prosperity, and surging national pride. The world they know is not one of Western dominance, but of Asian ascendance, unquote. How do you see this let's call it Asianization, and shift in Asian confidence, reshaping global financial markets and global trade dynamics?
Mhm. Well, first of all, again, when we titled the book "The Futurization," I was very grateful to my editor for having come up with it, so he does get full credit. But I said there's only one problem: the present is Asian, not just the future. And that
Okay.
was a critical point because, of course, in Western discourse about Asia, it's always as if there are rising powers that haven't yet risen, as if there are challengers that haven't yet become peer competitors and so forth.
Mm,
At what
mm,
point does one not wait for the incumbent to concede the space, but simply flip the table and realize that, well, to be Asia is to already be the center of the world, and it is others who must prove their relevance in Asia rather than the reverse. And
mhm,
I don't say that merely rhetorically. It's actually inherent in the definition of a global power that you have reach and influence on a worldwide scale. And
mhm,
if Asia is in fact the demographic and economic center of the world, which it absolutely categorically is today, right now, then it is for others to prove their relevance in Asia, not for Asia to prove its relevance to them. So
mhm,
that this is just a matter of empirical logic and fact. So now within Asia, of course, you have by far the largest volumes of global savings accumulation and trade surpluses and currency reserves. In fact, the majority of the world's savings are obviously in Asia. The question now
mm,
is and of course, industrial output as well. So the question
mm,
is what is the future allocation of Asian savings, whether that is a function of whether it's recycled into Western currency and debt markets or capital markets and equities and real estate and other asset classes, or whether it is invested or released to stimulate consumption and
mm,
internal adjustments and rebalancing in Asian economies. Now, in truth, Asians have done both. You couldn't possibly have the massive infrastructure build out and the growth in middle class consumption power and all of those other things if Asia weren't generating these enormous surpluses that have benefited not only the corporate sector and the government sector, but also households. So Asia has been having its cake and eating it too. The question is sort of, what comes next? But to be clear, it is, of course, Asian capital that has been a determinative factor, right, in many ways. It coupled, obviously, with low interest rates in the West, and now that you don't have that anymore, or at least
yeah.
haven't had that for a while, how Asians allocate capital becomes very decisive. And I can imagine, given what's happening with protectionism, the trade wars, and so forth, you're seeing a decline, to take just one outbound proxy, to take China. Chinese outbound FDI flows have dwindled to nearly zero into the
Mhm,
United States and Europe due to import restrictions, national security concerns, other kinds of regulations, but they've massively expanded um, in elsewhere across Asia and more broadly into the Belt and Road economies. So you're starting to see these shifts in the directionality of outbound Asian capital. And of course, again, that internal investment is going to be crucial given everything from demographic aging to investments in new technologies and building out new export routes and relationships and so on. So what historians call Afro-Eurasia, which is a term that I tried to revive in that book, we spoke of the pre-colonial, pre-Cold War Silk Road world. In
mm,
historical sociology, we call that Afro-Eurasia. In other words, before the Columbian epoch, before the
mhm,
Columbus epoch,
yeah.
the known world was Africa, Europe, and Asia, Afro-Eurasia, as it was known. So the
Mm,
Afro-Eurasian system of systems is once again in becoming central, other than in the specific ways in which the American system is a component of that, right?
mm, mm.
And that is the adjustment that is happening at that macro global level right now.
And if you think of that Silk Road era, it's 300, 400, 500 years back, what about the majority of the world's GDP was between China and India? So the past was also Asian. You said your book is called Future is Asian. You believe the present is Asian, but wasn't the past also Asian?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, so I actually, the toughest part of the book to write was actually the very first chapter. It
Mm,
took at least about half the time of writing the whole book was actually the history chapter, chapter one,
mm,
because it
mm,
was titled A History of the World from the Asian Point of View. And what I needed
mm,
to do was to summarize 4,000 years of Asian history in a way that not only captured what was happening in West Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, and East Asia during
mm,
each of the sort of component periods in a sequential manner, but to also tell the story in a way that would be palatable to the national narratives and maybe in some cases the censor boards of those
yeah.
countries. So could I
Mm,
come up with an adequate vocabulary, euphemisms, terminology to create one common template for the teaching of Asian history by Asians? And this was
mm,
crucial for two reasons. One is that there is a subfield known as global history. And global
mm,
history does try to capture the role of capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, and technology and cross-cutting forces as global phenomena rather than merely national history as some endogenous process, first of all.
mm, mm,
Second of all, it was disappointing to see that within Asia, despite the richly enmeshed histories that we do have,
yeah.
that national curricula focus entirely on those inside out, almost self-contained stories. And I thought this is
Mm,
obviously not true historically. It's intellectually bunk and unconstructive in a way. So I wanted to
mm,
do that. So this became a mission for me to kind of create that. And so what I
mm,
still should do, the book has many translations, but I would love to, particularly that chapter, almost have it available in each translation, freely available for download so that history teachers in the Philippines and Indonesia and India and Kazakhstan and China and
yeah.
Mongolia can all use
Yeah.
the same version.
But talking of which, Parag, isn't the teaching of history in most countries across the world colored by national pride? I mean, people don't read about imperialism in UK, for example, or colonialism, correct? I don't know how much the US has talked about their own, past in terms of uh, the interconnection with the rest of the world. Most countries tailor history to what suits them, isn't that right?
It's not about whether you tell a self-congratulatory, self-referential, and patriotic narrative of your own history. Every country is entitled to do that. It's if you also teach the global context that
Hmm.
shaped, supported, maybe contradicted and suppressed that history, for any given time period. That's what it's about. I cannot color to what extent patriotism and national politics will play a role. In the United States, they're in the process of abolishing the Department of Education anyway. So you even have
Correct.
lower levels of granularity. In India, as we very well know, state histories, provincial histories, linguistic histories are quite, or not just quite, extremely nuanced in terms
Correct.
of how they tell the story of their interactions with each other, the pride they take in their regional historical empires, how they dealt with British colonialism, and
Hmm.
their relationship to the modern Indian state. So I'm not trying to fight each local internal battle. It's
Hmm.
about providing a global context, because the amazing thing about globalization is that there has been a meaningful global context for many centuries, not least owing to technology and trade. And now more
Hmm.
recently, obviously, even culture, values, and discourse.
Hmm. Now, shifting gear, Parag, you famously said connectivity is destiny and that the most connected powers and people will win. Can you quantify this for our audience? What metrics should investors use to measure connectivity? And how does this translate into, let's say, investment alpha?
Right. So in terms of using So connectivity, first and foremost, you might say, is not just this ethereal concept. And this is one of the reasons why I had written that book, Connectography, because people spoke about connectivity as if it was genuinely a wireless, untethered phenomenon. But fundamentally, connectivity is infrastructure. You don't have any connectivity of any kind other than two people shaking hands without some form of infrastructural connectivity. It could be the road that allows you to drive down and visit a neighbor, or it's the fiber optic internet cable that's allowing us to have this conversation. And so though infrastructural connectivity fits into three baskets, transportation, energy, and communications more broadly. And markets obviously rest on top of those infrastructures. So markets are a process that leverages connectivity at various scale, robustness, speed, and so on. So focusing primarily on the fixed capital formation of infrastructure and the catalytic impact that has on growth in any economy, whether it is a mature economy or an emerging market, was the central point of departure. And we have very good data on this. We know, of course, if you go back to the Roman Empire, right, of course, you couldn't have the extraction from colonies without a robust road network. The same thing for Russia's expansion through the railways, the same thing obviously for the British Empire with railroads, and in general ports and steamships. And even within an economy like the United States that grew so tremendously throughout the 20th century, we have studies that quantify the role of the interstate highway system that was really built in the 1950s. So the GDP lift over time, whether it is for a rapidly growing modern advanced economy or whether it's an emerging market, is a measurable thing. It's measurable domestically, it's measurable internationally. So I sought to quantify the whole world of connectivity across these asset types and to quantify this sort of connectivity boost and lift. In a way, that's a subset of quantifying globalization and arguing for the benefits of globalization. So this was fundamentally a philosophy of connectivity, feeding a narrative around the past, present, and future of globalization. And we can see today that mature economies like Germany, have derelict infrastructure. And part of the platform of this government in Germany or any subsequent government is going to be to upgrade infrastructure, to get the trains running on time, to boost broadband internet access, all of these things. One of the novelties, though, right now in the infrastructure landscape is that there is a push towards more domestic or national self-sufficiency. So, for example, we're seeing this play out in energy systems. The more countries invest in renewables and in domestic energy production, in transmission lines, alternative renewable sources of energy, nuclear, wind, solar, biomass, whatever the case may be, the less they will depend on international commodities trade in hydrocarbon resources. That would lead to a technical diminution of one particular aspect of connectivity, which is the trade in hydrocarbon energy. And so people might say in 10 years, 20 years, look, globalization is reversing in this particular area. But I don't think you or I would have any qualms with that. I'm a globalization maximalist. I love to see globalization flourish. But I would not support, I would endorse deglobalization in the trade in hydrocarbon energy, just like I would endorse a deglobalization in agricultural trade. Why not grow more food locally, right? Why not have more hydroponic and aquaponic agricultural food production? Why should we kill the planet through increased greenhouse gas emissions by putting avocados and coal on ships? So I would celebrate a deglobalization in some areas. On the other hand, of course, none of that would actually be broadly representative of globalization as a whole, which is evolving into entirely new domains like the digital, right? For every one less ship carrying coal across the ocean, you have 10 more fiber optic internet cables carrying petabytes of data that are immensely more valuable than a few trucks of coal. So to be clear, globalization in volume and value continues to expand in many important areas, even as it recedes in others. And of course, connectivity, particularly in that digital domain, is a massively powerful and, of course, essential underpinning.
Absolutely. Parag, I must tell you that 8 years back, your book Connectography inspired my daughter Ragini's school essay into the US college. So she's very excited. Your book also inspired two global infrastructure mapping efforts. Now, with global infrastructure needs estimated at, you know, $94 trillion by 2040, how should investors think of infrastructure, what you talked about, infrastructure as an asset class? Is that something that one should look at in the investment world? And to your mind, what are some of the most undervalued connectivity investments today?
It's a very hot area, of course, of investment. Now, historically, and by which I mean deeper, longer history, infrastructure has been a publicly financed good. So again, whether that is transportation, energy, or communications. Of course, in the early 20th century, you had initial railroad financing, coming from the private sector of the United States. But worldwide, we think of infrastructure as being a public good. That's no longer the case primarily because of the telecommunications revolution, where whether it's internet cables, satellites, and so forth are now mostly privately launched. And the sort of pinnacle of this is data centers. So the data center capex build out is, of course, largely privately financed. What's quite different today is the role of private capital in telecommunications infrastructure. So whether it is fiber optic internet cables or satellites, and of course data centers today, it is really driven by private capital. There are in many cases sovereign investors as well, but they're doing it not to provide a global public good, but on the basis of the return profile of those investments. So we're starting to see private energy generation as well. There's a huge renewed interest in nuclear power and private financing of nuclear power in order to ensure robust baseload energy for data centers. So the private sector is taking an ever greater role in infrastructure across energy and across communications, and actually you could say in transportation too. If you think about micro-mobility, if you think about helicopter transport, drone delivery, these are all infrastructure assets that you're seeing the private sector coming in on. And of course it has to, because many public sectors, governments around the world simply don't have the capital available right now for long-term public financing of infrastructure. So we are seeing this multi-century scale sort of shift into private infrastructure finance. And what are the kind of hot areas? Again, needless to say, data centers seem to be at the top of everyone's list. But I would say really depends on the specific country's gaps. Energy being such a critical gap in many economies, data as well.
Parag, you believe that we are accelerating into a future shaped less by countries and more by connectivity. Tell me, does that mean that national sovereignty is becoming obsolete? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And in a post-Trumpian world, aren't we seeing evidence to the contrary?
So sovereignty never really goes away, in the sense that, strictly speaking, if sovereignty is the supreme authority of a government within its national boundaries, to be clear, we have more states. We have more nominally, juridically independent states, de jure independent states than ever in history, right? 200 of them. And we create one or two new ones, every few years. So their sovereignty, far from disappearing, again, is robust in number. But qualitatively, sovereignty is of course eroding, right? Countries don't entirely make their own laws and financial regulations and other kinds of things. There are intrusions on sovereignty from above and below. From below, it comes from civil society and private actors that have a role in governance. From the outside, it comes from multilateral organizations and from investment regulation and other kinds of ways in which there's a need to harmonize. So sovereignty does give way when it's beneficial to the states, or it's imposed through
Mm,
colonialism, imperialism, or other kinds of leverage.
mm,
So we can speak of sovereignty eroding in many ways, but its existence, it will never be dissolved completely. Migration controls are obviously the number one most powerful vestige of sovereignty, right? Every country still has and every country still exercises the right to determine for itself which human beings come across its borders, right? They may not always be able to fully control it on the ground,
mm.
but they maintain the political right to do so with no one able to supersede their authority, right? So sovereignty isn't going away. You're referring, I think, rightly to, populism, nationalism, protectionism, xenophobia, um, this basket of interrelated social and political phenomena that seem to be reasserting themselves. But what happens in one country isn't necessarily indicative of the whole world. And to be clear, the United States may be limiting inward migration on the one hand, but it's seeking more foreign investment on the other hand, right? So
Mm,
it is
mm,
allowing interdependence and flows to continue. It's simply dictating and taking a stronger hand in determining which flows. So it's moving away from unfettered, purely open borders globalization, which is, again, within its right to do, and every other country does and should do the same thing. But America's hard approach to this isn't necessarily reflective of the kind of the practices of many countries in the world that are more trade dependent, that are focusing on expanding their trade and financial and even migratory corridors with other countries. So that's something that we need to kind of reconstruct from the bottom up. But I would say that, America is not representative of the entire rest of the world.
And do you think there'll be a reaction of the Make America Great Again movement to make Europe great again, make India great again, make China great again? Where does this lead us into?
These movements and narratives contribute to and reinforce and help to inspire, the broader structural shift in the world that's underway towards a more multipolar system. Again,
Mm,
this is one of those issues where a lot of people talk about the world of the future becoming multipolar rather than simply acknowledging that it already is multipolar and has been. I
mhm,
wrote my first book about the multipolar order of the world as it was in the year 2005 when
mm,
I started writing the book 20 years ago. So
mm,
the world has only become more multipolar. It's not in the process of eventually becoming multipolar. It is matter-of-factly multipolar today. And
mm,
it's on the back of that that you see these narratives around, Chinese rejuvenation and the Indian way and the Saudi way and whatever the case may be. I
mhm,
don't expect anything less. A lot of my work is with these governments to help them to craft their diplomatic strategies in such a way that they benefit more
mm,
than their interlocutors, right? In
mm,
order to have, or to practice what I call multi-alignment. That
mhm.
was the animating principle of my first book. I said the smart countries of the emerging market set are practicing a multi-alignment. They don't choose one partner from this multipolar menu.
Yeah.
They choose to play all sides as actively as possible. So it is. I think I guess we're both children of the post-colonial world, and
Mm,
to me, that process of moving from the post-colonial to the post-colonial world, what is inherent in that, is the growing confidence of
mm,
nations as they come out of the colonial and post-colonial shadow and
mhm.
assert themselves, again, not just rhetorically, but with genuine economic and diplomatic and strategic agency. So I fully expect that to continue as countries do the things that actually build their own strong national foundations and allow them to negotiate on equal footing. And that's why we see such contentious diplomatic negotiations today in the areas of security, trade, and many other fora.
But Parag, if competitive connectivity is the arms race of the 21st century, as you famously say, how should global businesses adapt their strategies to prioritize connectivity over traditional geography boundaries? What should companies do differently?
Well, Well, so to be clear, it is in the best interest, or it is in the considered interest of many states and companies to pursue connectivity, to build the functional geographical corridors of interdependence with states in their own region and globally, right? That is what functional geography is. And the map of functional geography, the map of the world's highways, railways, and electricity transmission grids, pipelines, electricity grids, airports, internet cables, is vastly, vastly more voluminous in nature than all the world's borders lined up, right? So we continue to invest in the connectivity, not because any supranational force or authority from outer space has forced us to do it, right? We've voluntarily done it and continue to do it. So companies and countries have been equally beneficiaries of this. You can't imagine Chinese growth being what it has been without both its export-oriented economic growth model of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and simultaneously without having recycled those trade surpluses and currency reserves into domestic investments in infrastructure. So China is, of course, the sort of ground zero example of the benefits of the domestic and international dimensions of investing and benefiting from connectivity, both for the public sector, the private sector, and the household sector.
You talked there for about a multipolar world, Parag, and we're seeing that happening. In your mind, how should investors or portfolio managers adjust their geographic allocations for this multipolar reality?
I think this is very, very important, and it's part of one of the kind of animating background conditions or stimuli for my research has been a view that our sovereign ratings instruments, such as from S&P or Moody's, tend to very heavily discount the capability, the potential, the achievements of emerging markets, right? In other words, risk is overpriced. And so for the past 20 years that I've been active in this domain, we've seen an underallocation towards what have proven to be high growth opportunities, whether it is in Southeast Asia and the Gulf countries and elsewhere, simply because of a risk premium that is generated from looking at a very narrow set of indicators, right? And we've seen an underpricing of risk, by contrast, in nominally stable but pretty weak performing, OECD countries. And so I think, I've always sought to correct that, not because I'm championing the underdog for the sake of it, but simply because I'm using a holistic set of criteria to measure national stability and potential. Everything from the country's fixed capital formation, economic diversification strategies, climate resilience profile, and so on and so forth. And looking at those factors rather than the narrow indicators used in the kind of regulatory analytics of sovereign ratings, I find that the countries of Central Asia, of the Gulf, of Southeast Asia, South Asia are, whether or not they're deemed market grade by S&P, is not the only criteria you should be looking at. You should be looking at the firm level, at the sector level, at the national strategy and policy level, and making your own determination. So, I believe this very strongly for 20 years. I've written about it, extensively, and I feel that following these broader sets of signals can give you a window into dynamic, high growth markets. That's what AlphaGeo does. We have a very wide data catalog of our proprietary engineered features that are downscaled, looking at everything from the data center build out to the climate resilience to the human capital, educational rating, infrastructure investment of entire countries at the urban level, at the municipal level, provincial level, national level, to really give you a much more robust kind of view on whether or not a country is a good investment or not. So again, as I would have said 20 years ago, and I'm saying now, I think it's very important to lean into the countries that have a high future growth potential, not ones that have already achieved a plateau. That's not going to bring you growth.
This is a good time for a short commercial break. But before the break, I'm happy to remind you that you can now listen to any of the past Money Majlis podcasts on my website, www.moneymajlis.com. Visit the website, search by topic, and if you want, download additional resources for every episode. The website is a treasure trove of knowledge, wisdom, and insights from all my past guests, over 40 of them. And it has a link to my social impact initiative powered by Goodworld, where you can redeem your free $50 gift card for a charity of your choice. My guest today, Parag Khanna, has chosen to give his $1,000 Money Majlis gift card to the World Central Kitchen. Founded in 2010, World Central Kitchen is a non-profit organization that is the first to the front lines providing fresh meals in response to crises. Great choice, Parag, and thank you. As a listener, you can get a free $50 gift card by visiting my giving website, moneymajlis.com, and then choose a charity like World Central Kitchen where you want to contribute that money to. Thank you for helping me in contributing all profits from this podcast to charities. See you after this short break.
The financial world is changing fast. Institutions need to meet the growing client demand for crypto financial services, but they need a battle-tested platform to build upon.
AquaNow is a leading crypto financial services platform, powering incumbent institutions to launch crypto brokerage, payments, and remittance services for their clients, securely and at scale.
Be part of the transformation. Visit aquanow.com today.
The end touches your life.
In more ways than you can imagine.
You want more tech,
More speed.
more convenience,
More entertainment.
more business solutions,
EAN gives you all that.
and so much more. EAN. Go for more.
Parents teach their children to talk, to walk, to ride, to read. So why not teach them about managing their money? Introducing the all-new Live Light app, designed to teach 8 to 18-year-olds good money habits. A free and totally secure app designed for them that's always under your control. Top up their cards, set limits, assign tasks, and reward them with allowances. Download the LiveX app to open a Live Light account in minutes, and the first 50 dirham allowance is on us. Visit live.me today. Live Digital Bank by Emirates NBD. Trust and innovation combined. T's and C's apply.
Money Majlis is brought to you by Intellect Design Arena. Intellect drives digital adoption in banking and insurance. Leverage emac.ai, the most comprehensive, composable, and intelligent open finance platform for banking and insurance transformation. Intellect Design Arena.
The end touches your life.
In more ways than you can imagine.
You want more tech,
More speed.
more convenience,
More entertainment.
more business solutions,
EAN gives you all that.
and so much more. EAN. Go for more.
Money Majlis is brought to you by Network International, the Middle East, and Africa's digital payments champion. We make business happen and economies prosper by simplifying commerce and payments. Trusted by over 250 banks, fintechs and telcos, and 130,000 merchants in over 50 countries. Bringing you tomorrow's payment solutions today.
Welcome back. In this Money Majlis Extra edition, we are talking today to Dr. Parag Khanna, best-selling author, global strategy advisor, and one of the greatest thinkers of our time. Parag, you've written that cities, not states, are the engines of global civilization. Which megacities are best positioned, in your mind, to lead in resilience and innovation? It's a loaded question. Please answer the way you want to. And since I belong to the UAE, I will ask you, where do Dubai and Abu Dhabi figure on that list?
This is, to me, one of the favorite topics of discussion because, if you go back thousands of years to the dawn of human settlements, you find that every couple of centuries or every century there's new contenders and leaders when it comes to which are the most central commercial hubs, demographic centers, innovative cities, trade entrepôts, whatever the case may be. And so, of course, today, too, we're in this time of transition where last century's leading cities may not be those of the next 20, 30, 40 years. And at a minimum, what we see is that, as with multipolarity itself, this is not a world that's just dominated by London and New York, right? You have a world, of course, where the UAE is what I call a cities state, not a city state, but cities state of, the principal two Emirates, Abu Dhabi and Dubai, which, as you know, locals like to call Abu Dubai as they fuse into an infrastructural corridor of 100 plus kilometers in length. Needless to say, you also have Tokyo and Sydney and Shanghai and Beijing and Hong Kong's Greater Bay Area, stretching from Guangzhou to Hong Kong, and you have Singapore and so forth. So this is a multi-urban world. It's a world of roughly 50 or so megacity clusters. Those 50 megacity clusters do, in aggregate, represent the vast majority of the entire global economy, with the entire rest effectively being a rounding error, which is why I've been, making the claim for 15, 20 years that it always has been a world of cities, and with rapid urbanization will quite literally in the next couple of decades be a world where, again, as much as 80 to 90% of the world population will be clustered across cities. Now, if you think about the leading 10 or 20 cities, there doesn't have to be a number one, right? We're clearly seeing this in GDP size, in number of billionaires, in quality of life, in degree of connectivity, in innovation. There are 10 and 15 cities that are, you could say, relatively equal, and then it becomes a matter of personal preference whether one lives in one or more of those cities. But there are those that have a certain degree of momentum, right, versus others. Again, in some places like New York or London, you have a lot of legacy infrastructure that needs to be built. Then you have cities that are investing a lot in the infrastructure of modernization, and of course we're seeing this in the UAE. We're seeing this in let's say Toronto, Canada. You're seeing this, of course, in Chinese cities, and I think that what is one of the key factors is a risk that was not as present in previous generations or centuries, which is, of course, climate adaptation, right? The cities that can provide reliable electricity, cooling, and other ways of combating the elements at a time of elevated climate stress are obviously going to be more attractive than those that don't. And this is just one example of a factor, again, a risk factor that needs to be accounted for and addressed in order for a city to retain or to gain status as a desirable global hub in this century.
You've spoken about the, what do you call, the mobility imperative, Parag. What are the key factors driving human migration today, and how should governments respond?
First of all, we've never had migration at such a scale and volume and global vectors of migration connecting origin and destination as we have today. In the last 25 years in particular, the net migration flows within and across regions of the world, continents of the world, have exceeded anything like we'd ever seen in world history. As I like to say, the decimal point continues to move to the right every century, right? From single-digit millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions. And I reckon very soon with more than 1 billion people relocating perhaps permanently. So this is clearly a historical tide that cannot be reversed merely through short-term protectionist measures, xenophobic measures, so on. And that's because the demographic imbalances that are one of the key drivers of migration have never been more acute than they are today. The gap between old and young, the gap between the geographies that are climate resilient and not, the gap between those that are geopolitically stable and not, All of these are historical contributors. Climate.
And the gap between haves and have-nots as well, right?
Exactly. So economics, geopolitics, and climate all drive migration in one direction or the other, to some degree or the other, all the time. All of those underlying tailwinds are in overdrive right now. You have geopolitical volatility causing mass refugee flows. You have poverty and people seeking opportunity. You have technological displacement and people looking for work in services economies. You have climate-driven migration as well, and you have, again, the labor imbalances. All of those forces are quite literally in overdrive. So how could anyone actually expect migration to slow down or reverse? Now, that's precisely what some people did say during COVID. March of 2025 was very shortly before my book Move was supposed to be released. We had to delay the release of a book about the surging mass migration in the world because of the pandemic that caused the greatest lockdown in world history, where migration did in fact stand still. And needless to say, my publisher was not pleased for many reasons with the pandemic interfering in our schedule. But not intellectually, of course, they were worried that my thesis had been invalidated entirely by the COVID phenomenon. But if all we had to do was wait 1 year, and lo and behold, well, a year and a half, by the end of 2022, migration had literally reached record levels again, right? Absolute record levels, as if COVID had never happened. And so that's a reminder that there is a human tendency, a desire, an instinct to move, to relocate, to seek greener pastures and safer ground. And that's very much in effect today. Now, of course, again, many places are closing up. The United States has sealed its southern border to illegal immigration, but it does want to welcome legal migrants, right, based upon skills and so on. So a balloon, when squeezed, will inflate somewhere. And that is what we see happening today, which is why, one of the things I emphasized in the book is that even though it was called Move, it's really about moving, right? And it's often a zigzag, multi-step pattern that you see many, many hundreds of millions of individuals engaged in today.
In the book, you talk a lot about aging populations, Parag. Yet there are countries like Japan who refuse to open up their immigration policy. What do you say to those countries?
Well, Japan is a very interesting case because it is, of course, one of the most homogenous civilizations in the world, and therefore one of the most skeptical and reluctant when it comes to opening borders. But in fact, as we sit here today, there are 3 million non-Japanese people residing in Japan, which is by far the highest number ever recorded. Now, that's still less than 3% of the total population. But this is not one of those issues where you want to take a relative metric. You want to take the absolute metric. The absolute number of foreigners in Japan, 3 million people, is not only an all-time high, but given their concentration in core urban markets, they're a very visible part of the population today, especially in Tokyo and Fukuoka and elsewhere. So this is already quite a profound phenomenon in Japan, and it's already having an impact on their politics and so forth. So much so that in the most recent election, an anti-immigrant party made waves in that election. Now, you wouldn't have an anti-immigrant party making a name for itself in Japanese politics if you didn't already have a lot of migrants in the country. So we cannot really speak about Japan as either a low immigration country or a country that is still actively resisting migration. I would reframe it. Japan has embraced migration, so much so that there's already a backlash against its embrace of migration. It's embraced it in its own way, to the scale it needs to, and in fact still suboptimal in terms of the scale that it needs, to be clear, given the elderly care, deficiencies in elderly care and so forth. You still need a lot more migrants. And it continues to do so. And you can see in the liberalization of foreign investment laws or in the housing market. You can see it in the bilateral skills training programs by which they're importing everything from construction workers to software engineers and so on and so forth. So we should think of Japan as a high migration country, but in its own way, calibrated to its own needs and at its own time scale.
Parag, let me shift gear here to your entrepreneurial journey. As the founder and CEO of AlphaGeo and Future Map, you built data-driven advisory firms from scratch in a very competitive global landscape. What advice would you give to entrepreneurs building data-driven platforms in emerging markets?
Well, data-driven platforms are necessary everywhere, not just in emerging markets. And I think that it's fundamentally not just about data itself, because nowadays with LLMs and AI and co-pilots, you're competing against forces that can structure data very, very rapidly. So building proprietary data is key. Proprietary data that's useful for training, proprietary data that's valuable for commercial applications, proprietary data that's standardized and can be used for benchmarking, for validation, for forecasting, and so on. So AlphaGeo is in the business of building proprietary engineered data sets through our own data transformation processes using geospatial data, demographic data, infrastructure data, market data, and so on. Harmonizing, downscaling, systematically delivering this alt data, as some might call it, and also building forecasting models around the economic performance of geographies based on that data. So it's not just about building a SaaS company or building a data company. It's about building proprietary analytics around which you have a moat and that therefore commands high value.
Parag, your career spans advising the U.S. National Intelligence Council, working with the World Economic Forum, and advising 40 plus countries. You advise governments as well as Fortune 500 companies. What leadership principles have you developed from navigating both the public and private sectors across different cultures? How would you summarize some of those lessons?
I still find that irrespective of whether it is a country of the East, West, North, or South, there's still a big gap in public and private sector approaches to harnessing outside data, talent, prescriptions, whatever the case may be. In theory, governments all want to be more efficient, managerial, corporate, CEO-like, and so on. In practice, there's still a very, very long way to go. Now, of course, the private sector has its weaknesses, and the public sector has its own, but I still see a very strong gap. I would like to see them converge around the principles that I sort of fashion or sort of categorize as being technocratic skills. And technocracy is an old term, a century-old term, really, and even a movement. But what I've tried to do is to kind of rigorously apply what I think of as technocratic principles to management, whether it is public or private sector. For example, I don't really believe there should be a single authority or executive in an organization that doesn't simultaneously take into account in a very structured way a peer level consultation. The archetype for me is the Swiss government, where they have a federal executive council. There are, in effect, 7 heads of state in Switzerland at any given time. One happens to be the one who goes around to summits and conferences, but they rotate every year. No head of state in Switzerland by design serves in that position for more than 1 year. It's a technical annual honorific, but it's a committee of 7. 7 heads are better than 1. I believe that principle should be used in both the public sector and the private sector. And it's one of the things that I try to help, organizations to revise their governance around. Another, obviously, is just interdisciplinary forecasting. There's way too much GDP targeting, and reliance on outdated benchmarks of performance. Whereas when I'm working with governments, or stakeholders, I'm looking at what is the outcome that they actually want to achieve. Is it national well-being? Is it stability? Is it economic diversification? What are they willing to concede or invest to get that outcome? Not simply what academic archetype are they trying to please, right? Such as a GDP growth figure, right? That kind of thing. So holistic national strategy is another principle. And why is that technocratic? It's also because you have to juggle competing interests and reconcile those interests, which is not something that can be done in a bottom-up democratic deliberative fashion, right? In a hyper-complex world such as today, you have to factor in long-term and short-term, right? Core economic, but also social and cultural perspectives. Reconciling all of this takes, something of a top-down view, but not one person alone, right? So developing the mechanisms to be holistic, taking broad data streams, thinking long-term, not doing it alone. These are just some examples of kind of technocratic principles that as I've been advising governments and boards for a long time, that I've sort of accumulated and tried to kind of document. Now with AlphaGeo, I want to integrate our proprietary data into that process. So when we work with the government, when we work with a company, it's no one should be shooting from the hip. When a corporate asks us, what are the next 10 markets we should expand into, we're going to do a very rich and detailed exercise around identifying what is their core product, what are the geographies of lowest friction but highest benefit, what is the cost of entry into those markets, and market potential, market sizing kinds of exercises, but with a much broader array of data than is typically used. So that's just one example. When we're working with the government, they all know they want to have a Silicon Valley, right? Which country doesn't say, tell me how to have a Silicon Valley, right? We look at the components of what specific, meaningful, tangible things they would actually need to do. The way I frame it often with a government client would be, what is the role that you wish to occupy in the global division of labor, right? The global division of labor is a very constantly changing, evolving landscape of opportunity, of supply chain connections, of innovation, of, how can you be a hub? What does it take? Does it mean that you have to have an academic partnership with University X in country Y that will help train your workers in skill Z, which will lead to the formation of company A, which will be a supplier to investor B, and which you will tax investor C? Right? That level of detail, not pie in the sky kinds of visions. And it goes back to some degree to your question about cities, because over the past 20 years, Aisha and I have gone to many new cities that were PowerPoint decks. They were places that didn't exist on the map, but governments, either municipal governments, provincial governments, or national governments, sought to put a stake in the ground and say, here, this is where we will build a gleaming, shining new city that will be a hub, that will be the next global city. And we've seen that most of these never actually happened, right? They are still piles of dirt. And the reason is because as much as they may have hired a starchitect to deliver a master plan, they didn't develop the economic master plan. They didn't answer that question, what will be the actual role of this place, this physical place in the global division of labor? So I break that question down into the most granular possible components, and we provide the data that then helps to identify what the opportunity will be for that country based upon its factor endowments and so on. And that to me is very exciting, because I believe that, of course, if you aggregate, if you expand that principle to the nth degree to all places in the world, you would have a world in which you had a much greater exploitation of each's comparative advantage in a very constructive bottom-up way. And that should be a world that we all aspire to.
And looking back, Parag, which do you consider to be your most challenging assignment to date?
Oh, that's a very good question. There have been a few, and I think back to, well, here's one that was, sort of out of the blue, but existential for that country, or I should say catastrophic for that country. It was Malta. The government of Malta was hit by COVID and declining tourism revenue, and the European Union trying to crack down on its gaming industry and other sorts of industries, and its and it's investment migration schemes all at the same time. And so in early 2020, they came to us and said, can you do a whole new national strategy for us that's actually something we can implement in light of the indeterminate nature of COVID and our need to innovate and all of these other things. So that was all done remotely. It was, a very challenging, exercise for our team, but we did generate a strategy that, proved to be actionable for that country. And, I've really enjoyed all of the government work because I'm trained as a political scientist. I have a bias in some way towards public service, broadly defined. So any opportunity that we get to help a country, to improve the standard of living and well-being of its people is something that I'll jump at. And right now, it's a world that is desperately in need of climate adaptation strategies at the subnational level all over the world. And so that's an area that we're very heavily involved in.
You also advise the U.S. Special Operation Forces, I believe, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Tell us a bit more about what prompted that and what leadership lessons do you learn from that assignment?
Well, that was quite an experience, to say the least. Now, it's a bit dated, actually, because if you recall back to the period of the surge in the U.S. occupation of Iraq and to some degree Afghanistan as well, there were two simultaneous wars going on in the mid-late 2000s, neither of which was going particularly well. I had served as a civilian researcher to a very prominent Army commander who had then been tapped to run Special Operations Forces and a particularly elite unit in Special Operations Forces, shuttling across multiple theaters of conflict simultaneously. And so because he knew me in a personal capacity, in a civic capacity, in an academic and policy capacity, he trusted me and invited me to become, sort of a right-hand strategic voice and observer and advisor. So I did join the Pentagon, and I did suit up and boot up and deploy, and spent quite some time across 2007 and 8 in these very active war zones, and sort of forward deployed. And it was certainly perhaps I learned more than I was able to contribute, in the sense that even though I knew those geographies very well from my own research, and I traveled in these countries alone previously to research my first book. So I did have a lot of kind of, let's say anthropological or social political knowledge of the places. But one of the things I learned is that, even the greatest, most powerful commanding general, or for that matter, army of a superpower, really is its influence, its impact is situational, it's contingent, it's very time-bound. And we know that now in retrospect when you think about what has become of Iraq and Afghanistan, right? When you look at Afghanistan today, you would say, what is the meaningful, tangible evidence that American occupying forces presided here, governed and ran this country to the tune of, trillions of dollars of investment for more than a decade? You wouldn't find much physical evidence, right? And that's a very humbling part of my reflection, on that experience. But was I inspired by the figures that I worked with? Of course I was, and no doubt. But again, even they, in all of their humility, and as you know very well, it is themselves the selfless public servants of militaries that are very, very humble creatures. They know this, and they knew this. They knew that lasting impact would be very difficult to have on just the battlefield alone.
Parag, your wife Ayesha Khanna is an AI entrepreneur, an advisor to companies on AI. Your teenage daughter Zara is an AI engineer who wants to research AI safety. In your dining table conversations, in your family dining table conversations, what is the family view on the theory that AI is going to make the human race dumber?
Well, the first topic of conversation is 3 words: eat your veggies. But once we have that out of the way, we can move on to weightier subjects like the impact of AI. there's a famous phrase, program or be programmed. And Aisha very much emphasizes learning the fundamentals of computer science, of programming, of software engineering, of understanding the architecture of systems, even if they are LLMs that are meant to displace you. So always be one step ahead in understanding them, being able to prompt them, code them, and so forth. And so, staying one step ahead of the technology is crucial. So yes, many people, many jobs will be displaced, but there is a utility, of course, for each person still in the world. And, not everyone is going to become a data engineer by any means. But we also emphasize, and this is both in a public and a private context, that we should still see AI as a partner, not as a rival, right? It can ultimately lead to, and does substantially augment productivity. At the end of the day, we want to enhance and improve each human being's capacity in and of themselves, but then their productivity in the economy. So, we hope that AI can be made accessible to all people so that they can use it in a personal context, in a professional context, to boost their own productivity.
Parag, you've been named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century. You've been featured in Wired's Smart List. Tell me, what personal values and habits have been critical to your career progression from a research associate at the Council on Foreign Relations to a global thought leader today?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I would maybe reframe it or rephrase it a little bit, which is, the sort of I enjoy communicating with young people as often as possible. It helps me feel young, keeps us in touch with the next generation, and gives us a finger on the pulse on trends. And they often ask, what is your one piece of advice or whatever you learn that you would impart and recommend to young people today? And then there's obvious and non-obvious answers there. The obvious ones that I myself didn't follow are, study computer science and math and learn to code. Those are not things I did as a young person. So then we can narrow it down to what I did do that I do think has been, for me, an instrumental part of my own just evolution. And even it was accidental first and then it's something I embraced, but it's travel. It's simply travel. And in a way, you could first wax eloquently about the beauty, the aesthetic, benefit and reward of traveling in and of itself, and the knowledge you gain and the first-hand experience and the confidence it gives and the ways in which it can help you differentiate your perspective from the mainstream, having first-hand knowledge, authority, and experience in places. That's been my story, again, accidental as it may be. But in today's world, I actually find that it resurfaces as being particularly valuable in two ways. The first is that in a world where you don't know where your job is going to be, your physical job, you really do need to be willing to go anywhere, right? The place you live in may be made obsolete by climate or technology or whatever the case may be, and you may need to physically get up and go somewhere else. You may not be able to afford to be where you are. So being mobile is itself a skill in a world where you don't know where your future job is. In other words, being geographically fungible yourself as a person. So being open to being mobile and moving is itself a skill that I recommend, and I think young people get it today, and you can actually see it in the demographic patterns. The willingness of young people to get up and move is higher than ever before, and their constraints are lower than ever before because young people are less likely to own a home and have children, right? And they live in a more open world. The second one is more relevant to these overwhelming, themes of technology today, which is that in a world where so much content is third-party, AI-generated, lacking in authenticity, how are you to know what is real? How are you to validate and authenticate that which is true in the world? You must actually go and see it, touch it, feel it with your own eyes. So in a way, a restoration of the virtue of firsthand experience and aesthetic appreciation of the real world and your ability to go and embrace it fearlessly actually becomes more valuable than ever, right? So the authentic photograph versus the AI-generated image. right?
Mm,
Speaking the language and understanding exactly what someone said rather than it having been something that was deep faked, right?
mm, mm.
Ultimately, we will have to rely on our instincts or on some form of, cryptographic verification, whatever the case may be. But I'm very comfortable with that return to the authentic because travel has always been, for me, the foundation of the authenticity that I feel is a critical factor in success.
So you're saying adaptability is going to be a key factor in shaping careers in the future.
No question. And again, it already is. Even the futurists among us should really stop talking about the future as if it isn't already the present, just not evenly distributed, as William Gibson famously said.
And my final question, Parag, looking ahead, what is your forecast, if you had to put it in a few words, for the next wave, whether in technology, geopolitics, or where people will move for better futures? What is your forecast for that?
I do think there are certain structural mega trends that are playing out today that are truly irreversible. I do think urbanization is an unstoppable force, right? In effect, it's asymptotic. Eventually almost everyone is going to live in a city of some size, right? And we may even increasingly concentrate in one of 400 or 500 cities in the world. So again, there'll be a world of a couple of hundred cities more so than a world of a couple of hundred countries. And the connectivity among those cities will continue to expand, right? Whether that is, again, the categories of infrastructure that we spoke about earlier, transportation, energy, communications. Again, you may see some reduction in some aspects if you have completely self-contained energy systems and so forth. And that would be a good thing. But physical mobility across those cities, as I've said before, I think this is a global urban network civilization. An accurate description of the human species today is that we are global, urban, and connected in networks. It is not accurate to say that we are primarily divided into 200 bordered states. That happens to be a feature of the world, but it isn't the overriding paradigm that defines our daily human lives, right? It is much more being a global, urban, connected civilization. So urbanization, connectivity, the exigency of climate adaptation is another, critical factor that's going to drive human behavior and investment strategy in the future as well. So there's a number of these forces, that I think of as, again, structural, irrevocable megatrends that despite all the uncertainty and complexity in the world today, you can still be fairly confident in and have high conviction that these will shape the future. And I do think, of course, from these, you can derive very useful, very tangible investment strategies.
Excellent. Parag, before I close, I want to ask you a few fun rapid fire questions to get to know Parag the person, not just Parag the futurist. Quick answers, no overthinking, and your time starts now. If you weren't a strategist, what would you be doing?
Tennis player.
Wow. One book other than yours that changed your view of the world.
A Study of History by Arnold Toynbee.
One thing that people misunderstand about Asia.
Its geographic scope. People think of Asia as just Greater China, but as we discussed today, it's from the Mediterranean to Japan and Russia to Australia.
Well said. If you could time travel to any historical era, what would that be?
The medieval period of the Central Asian Silk Roads under the empire of Amir Timur.
Wonderful, wonderful. Your current guilty pleasure outside of work?
Bounty bars.
Okay. And if you could teleport to any city for dinner tonight, what would that be? What city would that be?
I'd join you. I'd fly to Mumbai and take you out to Bombay Canteen.
Absolutely. One of my favorite restaurants too. The best advice you have given your children?
Travel as frequently as you can.
And the best advice your children have given to you?
Less screen time and more sleep.
Haha. Your favorite Asian cuisine?
I actually grew up in New York eating Chinese sweet and sour chicken. So I have a nostalgic, sentimental sweet spot for that.
I love that too. And
Even though, of
finally,
course, no one in China would ever actually eat it.
and finally, one surprising thing that people don't know about you.
I think I'm something of an open book, but I used to look like Pete Sampras, the tennis player, when I was 19 years old.
You still do, actually, to some extent. Dr. Parag Khanna, author, futurist, and entrepreneur, thank you for joining us on Money Majlis today. Your insights, Parag, I guess at the intersection of geography, technology, and capital flows offered me, and I'm sure our listeners, a very unique lens for understanding our rapidly changing world. And thank you, Parag, for also donating your $1,000 gift card to World Central Kitchen as part of the Money Majlis giving campaign. To my audience, I encourage you to explore Parag's books, particularly The Future is Asian and Connectography, two of my favorites, which provide essential frameworks for thinking about investment opportunities in our connected age. You can also learn more about his work at AlphaGeo and follow his strategic insights on LinkedIn. The future may be uncertain, but as Parag reminds us, connectivity is destiny, and understanding the connectivity is key to navigating the investment landscape ahead.
Money Majlis is proudly supported by Aqua Now, the premier crypto-as-a-service provider, now building in partnership with the top financial institutions in the Middle East. Discover more at aquanow.com.
Money Majlis is brought to you by E&, a global technology group.
Money Majlis is brought to you by Intellect Design Arena, driving digital adoption in banking and insurance.
Money Majlis is brought to you by Live Digital Bank, powered by Emirates NBD. Trust and innovation combined.
Money Majlis is brought to you by Network International, the leading digital payments technology company in the Middle East and Africa.
Money Majlis is conceived and scripted by me, Suvo Sarkar. It's produced by Sabine Achkar at Podster and is supported by Aquanow, Emirates NBD, E&, Intellect Design Arena, and Network International. My giving partner is Good World. If you found this episode insightful, share it with a friend or colleague, subscribe to the show, and visit moneymajlis.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring the forces reshaping global finance. Until next time, goodbye and ma salama. Stay well and do good.